My husband threw money at me like I was a stripper and making me crawl around picking bills off the floor while his friends laughed. I showed him why he can't afford me. For 6 years, my husband Wade treated our marriage like a transaction where I was always on the losing end. It started on our honeymoon. We were at a resort gift shop and I saw a bracelet I liked. Nothing expensive, maybe $40. I asked Wade if we could get it. He pulled out his wallet, peeled off some bills, and threw them at me. They fluttered down around my feet while the shop clerk watched. I was so embarrassed I just picked them up and bought the bracelet without saying a word. I told myself it was a weird moment. Honeymoon stress. But it wasn't a moment. It was a preview of the next 6 years of my life. Wade made excellent money as a commercial real estate broker. When we got married, he convinced me to quit my job as an office manager so I could focus on making our house a home. He said he'd take care of everything financially. What he actually meant was he'd control everything financially. I had no access to our accounts. No credit cards in my name. Every single thing I needed, I had to ask him for. And every single time I asked, he threw money at me. Groceries. He'd toss $100 on the kitchen floor and tell me to make it last. Gas for my car. He'd flick a 50 at my lap while watching TV. New clothes because mine were wearing out. He'd count the bills slowly, then scatter them on the bed like he was making it rain at a club. At first I thought maybe this was just some quirk of his. Maybe he didn't realize how demeaning it was. So I told him. Sat him down and explained that throwing money at me made me feel worthless. Like I wasn't his wife, but his employee. Or worse. He laughed. Said I was being dramatic and oversensitive. Said most wives would be thrilled to have a husband who gave them whatever they wanted without asking questions. He didn't understand that it wasn't about the money. It was about the way he gave it to me. Like I was beneath him. Like I should be grateful to grovel at his feet and pick up whatever he tossed my way. The behavior got worse when his friends were around. He'd make a show of it. I'd mention needing something and he'd announce to whoever was there that duty calls, then pull out his wallet with this smug grin. His friends would chuckle while I crawled around collecting bills off the floor. One of them called me a lucky woman. Wade said she knows it. I stopped asking for things in front of other people. Then I stopped asking for things at all unless absolutely necessary. I learned to make do with what I had. Wore the same clothes for years. Cut my own hair. Stretched groceries as far as they could go. Wade didn't even notice. As long as the house was clean and dinner was ready, and I looked presentable at his work events, he didn't care what I needed. 3 years ago, I secretly started taking online courses at night. Accounting and bookkeeping. Wade went to bed early and slept like the dead, so he never knew I was up until 2 in the morning studying. I got certified. Then I started taking on small freelance clients. Just a few hours a week at first, working from my laptop while Wade was at the office. I opened my own bank account at a different bank across town. Every dollar I earned went straight into it. Wade had no idea. He thought I spent my days cleaning, cooking, and waiting for him to come home. The account grew slowly but steadily. After 3 years, I had enough to leave. Enough for first and last month's rent on an apartment. Enough to survive for 6 months while I built up my client base. Enough to hire a divorce attorney. The day I left, I waited until Wade went to work. Packed everything that was mine and nothing that was his. I left my wedding ring on the kitchen counter with a stack of cash next to it. Every single dollar totaled up to exactly what he'd thrown at me over the past month. Grocery money, gas money, the $30 he'd tossed at me for tampons while muttering about how expensive it was to be a woman. I left a note that said, "Keep the change." He called me 4 hours later, screaming, demanding to know where I was, saying I had no right to leave, saying I'd be nothing without him. I hung up and blocked his number. The divorce was messy because Wade made it messy. He was furious that I'd been working without his knowledge. Even more furious with what the attorney revealed. I'd found Wade's attorney information in one of the old papers I'd kept. Blake Whitfield's office was in a glass tower downtown, the kind of building Wade would approve of. I took the elevator to the 14th floor and gave my name to the receptionist. She led me to a conference room with windows overlooking the city. Blake walked in 5 minutes later, a tall man in his 50s with gray hair and reading glasses hanging from a chain around his neck. He shook my hand and sat across from me at the polished table. I'd brought everything I could find in a manila folder, my hands shaking as I pushed it toward him. He opened it and started reading through the papers, making notes on a legal pad. After maybe 10 minutes, he looked up at me and asked how long this had been going on. I told him 6 years. He asked if Wade ever hit me, and I said no, never physically. Blake nodded and said what Wade did was called economic abuse, and it was just as real as any other kind. He wanted to know about Wade's income, his accounts, his assets. I explained I had no idea what Wade actually made or where he kept his money. Blake asked if I had any bank statements, and I showed him the few I'd pulled from Wade's desk before I left. He studied them and asked about retirement accounts, investment properties, business partnerships. I didn't know about any of it. Wade never told me anything about his finances except when he was throwing money at me and telling me to make it stretch. Blake made more notes and said we had a lot of work ahead of us. Blake explained that because Wade kept me completely in the dark about our finances during the marriage, the court would force him to show everything. Every account, every asset, every dollar he earned. Wade's attorney had already called Blake's office trying to pressure me into taking a small settlement and walking away. Blake said that told him Wade was worried about what would come out during the legal process. He asked if I was ready for this to get ugly, because Wade would fight to keep control however he could. I said I was ready. I'd been ready since the day I left. Blake gave me a list of documents to find. Anything with Wade's name or signature that might show money or property I didn't know about. Old tax returns, credit card statements, receipts, anything. He said even small pieces of paper could help build the picture of what Wade was hiding from me. I left his office feeling like someone finally believed me, like what Wade did actually mattered in a way that could be proven. I spent the next week going through every box I'd packed when I left the house. I found tax returns from 3 years ago in a folder I'd grabbed thinking it had my certification papers in it. There were bank statements Wade had left on his desk that I'd used as scratch paper for my accounting homework. Receipts from his wallet that I'd found in the laundry and kept meaning to throw away but never did. I made copies of everything at the library and put them in order by date. It wasn't much, but Blake had said to bring whatever I had. I dropped the copies off at his office on Thursday afternoon, and the receptionist said he'd review them and call me. Walking back to my car, I felt like I was doing something instead of just surviving what Wade had done to me. My phone rang Friday morning from a number I didn't know. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. Wade's voice came through screaming before I could even say hello. He called me every name he could think of, said I was trying to destroy him and take everything he'd worked for. I remembered what Blake told me during our meeting, and I opened the voice recorder app on my phone. Wade kept yelling about how I had no right to his money, how I never earned anything myself, how I was nothing without him. He said he'd make me pay for this betrayal, make me regret ever thinking I could leave. His voice got louder and meaner with every sentence. I didn't say a word, just let him talk while my phone recorded every threat. After maybe 5 minutes, he hung up and I saved the recording. My hands were shaking, but I had proof now of exactly who Wade was when nobody else was listening. Bethany called that afternoon and asked how I was holding up. I told her about Wade's phone call and she said to send that recording to my attorney right away. Then she said she had some good news for me. 3 people in the accounting group had asked for my contact information because they needed bookkeeping help. Small businesses, nothing huge, but steady monthly work if I wanted it. I said yes before she even finished explaining what they needed. Bethany laughed and said word was getting around that I was reliable and didn't charge an arm and a leg like the big firms. My little freelance business was growing without me even trying to advertise. I thanked her and promised to send her something nice once I got paid. She said just keep being good at what I do and send more clients her way when I got too busy. The divorce papers arrived in my mailbox on Monday. Official court documents with Wade's attorney's name at the top. I read through them sitting on my apartment floor, my stomach turning with every page. Wade was demanding I return to the marital home immediately. He claimed I abandoned the marriage without cause or warning. He said I had no grounds for divorce and was trying to steal his property. The papers asked the court to order me back to the house and deny me any spousal support or division of assets. I called Blake and read him the whole thing over the phone. He said this was typical, just Wade's attorney trying to scare me into giving up. We'd file our own response documenting everything Wade did and demanding my fair share of what we built together during the marriage. Blake said not to worry about Wade's claims because we had evidence of the abuse, and that would matter more than whatever story Wade's lawyer tried to tell. Tuesday afternoon, my landlord knocked on my door with a toolbox. He said the bathroom sink had been dripping and he wanted to fix it before it got worse. I let him in and he went to work on the pipes under the sink. It took him maybe 20 minutes to tighten everything and stop the leak. When he came out, he looked around my apartment and said he was impressed. I'd hung some pictures I bought at a thrift store and arranged my few pieces of furniture to make the space feel bigger. He said most people who rent this unit just throw their stuff anywhere, but I'd actually made it look like a home. It was such a small comment, but it hit me hard. Nobody had complimented something I did in years without Wade taking credit or finding something wrong with it. I thanked the landlord and he left, and I stood there in my tiny apartment feeling proud of myself for the first time in longer than I could remember. Blake filed our response to Wade's petition on Thursday. He sent me a copy and I read through the detailed accounts of Wade's financial abuse, the pattern of control, the humiliation, everything. Seeing it written out in legal language made it real in a different way. Blake had included a demand for equal division of all marital assets and fair spousal support while I built my business. He called me that evening and said Wade would get served with these papers tomorrow. He warned me that Wade would probably lose his mind when he saw what we were claiming, and I should be ready for him to escalate. I said I understood and would keep my phone nearby in case I needed to call the police. Wade showed up at my apartment building at 11 that night. I was getting ready for bed when I heard pounding on my door and his voice shouting from the hallway. He called me a thief, said I stole from him, demanded I open the door right now. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911 while Wade kept pounding. The operator answered and I told her my estranged husband was at my door threatening me, and I had a protective order application pending. She said officers were on their way and to stay on the line. Wade's shouting got louder, saying he knew I was in there and I couldn't hide from him. Other apartment doors opened and neighbors looked out to see what was happening. The police arrived maybe 8 minutes later and I heard them talking to Wade in the hall. His voice changed completely, became calm and reasonable, said he just wanted to talk to his wife. The officers told him he needed to leave and escorted him down to the lobby. One of them knocked on my door and I let him in to take my statement. He wrote down everything Wade said and did, and told me this would go in the report for my protective order hearing. The next morning, I met Blake at his office to file for a temporary protective order. I brought the recording of Wade's threatening phone call and the police report from last night. Blake listened to the recording twice and said combined with Wade showing up at my apartment, we had solid grounds for the judge to grant protection. He filled out the paperwork while I sat across from him, and I signed everywhere he pointed. Blake said the hearing would probably be scheduled within a week, and based on what we had, he was confident the judge would order Wade to stay away from me. We filed the papers at the courthouse that afternoon, and I walked out knowing I'd done everything I could to keep myself safe from the man I used to think would protect me. The protective order hearing was scheduled for Tuesday morning. I showed up at the courthouse with Blake at 8:30, and we sat on a wooden bench outside the courtroom waiting for our case to be called. Wade arrived 15 minutes later with his attorney, a tall man in an expensive suit who looked like he charged $500 an hour just to breathe. Wade glanced at me once, his face twisted with anger, then looked away. Blake leaned over and told me not to make eye contact or engage with Wade in any way. I nodded and kept my eyes on the floor. When the judge called our case, we walked into the courtroom and took our seats at separate tables. The judge was a woman in her 50s with gray hair pulled back tight. She looked at the police report, listened to the recording of Wade's threats, and asked Wade's attorney if he had anything to say. The attorney stood up and claimed Wade was just upset about the divorce and didn't mean any harm. The judge cut him off and said showing up at someone's home at 11 at night and pounding on the door while shouting threats is not acceptable behavior regardless of emotional state. She granted the temporary protective order requiring Wade to stay 500 feet away from me and prohibiting all contact except through attorneys. Blake was right. It strengthened our case. 2 days later, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. It was a man named Mitch who said Bethany gave him my contact information. He owned a small construction company and needed someone to handle his monthly bookkeeping. His previous bookkeeper retired and he was behind on everything. We talked for 20 minutes about what he needed and I gave him my rates. He agreed immediately and said he'd email me the contract and first month's retainer. When I hung up, I pulled up my banking app and calculated what the retainer would mean. It was more than Wade used to throw at me for an entire month of groceries. I sat there staring at my phone, realizing my business was actually becoming real. The next afternoon, Wade's mother called. I saw her name on the screen and my stomach dropped, but I answered because ignoring her would just make things worse. She was crying before I even said hello. She told me I was tearing the family apart and ruining Wade's reputation. Everyone at their church was talking about the divorce. People were asking questions. She said Wade was a good provider and I should be grateful instead of dragging him through court. I listened to her sob for a full minute before I said anything. When she finally stopped to take a breath, I told her that Wade's idea of providing was throwing money at me like I was working at a club and making me crawl around on the floor picking up bills while his friends laughed. I told her he controlled every dollar I spent for 6 years and humiliated me every single time I needed something. There was silence on the other end. Then she said, "That's just how men are sometimes. They don't always know how to show affection properly." I hung up without saying goodbye. She called back 3 times, but I didn't answer. There was no point. She would never understand that what Wade did wasn't about affection or providing. It was about power and control. Blake called me Friday morning with good news. The judge signed the protective order, which meant it was now official and enforceable. He also said this would help our case in the divorce proceedings, because it established a pattern of threatening behavior. Blake explained that his team was preparing discovery requests to serve on Wade, demanding documentation of all his income, assets, and financial transactions for the past 6 years. He warned me that Wade's attorney would probably object to most of the requests, because that's what lawyers do when their clients have something to hide. I thanked him and hung up feeling like things were finally moving in the right direction. That same day, I had my first appointment with a therapist named Elena, who specialized in financial abuse and controlling relationships. Blake recommended her after I mentioned having trouble sleeping and feeling anxious every time I saw someone who looked like Wade. Her office was in a small building near the library, and the waiting room had comfortable chairs and magazines about gardening. When she called me back, I followed her into an office with soft lighting and a couch that didn't look like a therapy couch. She asked me to tell her why I was there, and I started explaining about the divorce and Wade's behavior. But when I got to the part about him throwing money at me and making me pick it up off the floor, I started crying. Actually crying, not just tearing up. I couldn't stop. Elena handed me a box of tissues and waited. When I finally got myself together, I apologized for losing it. She said there was nothing to apologize for. She said what I described was abuse, and saying it out loud probably made it feel more real and more embarrassing. I nodded because that was exactly how it felt. Like admitting Wade treated me that way meant admitting I let him treat me that way. Elena spent the rest of the session explaining that shame is something abuse victims feel all the time, but the shame belongs to the abuser, not the victim. She said I survived 6 years of someone systematically breaking down my sense of worth, and the fact that I got out and built a new life meant I was stronger than I probably realized. Before I left, she gave me some papers with exercises for recognizing when I was blaming myself for Wade's choices. I folded them up and put them in my purse. Not sure if I'd actually do them, but grateful someone understood what I'd been through. The following week, Blake's team served Wade with the discovery requests. I didn't see it happen, but Blake called me afterward and said Wade's attorney responded within hours with objections to almost every single request. Blake laughed and said this was completely expected. Attorneys always object first and negotiate later. He said we'd file a motion to compel if Wade didn't cooperate, and the judge would force him to turn over the documents. The important thing was that we were putting pressure on Wade to reveal his actual financial situation, not the fake version he wanted everyone to believe. While all the legal stuff was happening, my business kept growing. I landed 2 more clients in the same week, both small businesses that needed basic bookkeeping services. One was a landscaping company and the other was a hair salon. The salon owner found me through my website, and the landscaping company was another referral from Bethany. I did the math and realized I was now making enough each month to cover my rent and expenses without touching my savings. The feeling was incredible. Every dollar I earned went into my account with my name on it. Nobody threw it at me. Nobody made me ask permission to spend it. Nobody controlled when or how I could access it. It was mine because I worked for it, and that felt better than any expensive gift Wade ever bought me to show off to his friends. Then Wade violated the protective order. I woke up Tuesday morning to find 3 emails from an address I didn't recognize. The subject lines were all variations of calling me names. I opened the first one and immediately recognized Wade's writing style. He called me a gold digger who never loved him and only married him for his money. He said I was trying to steal everything he worked for and turn everyone against him. The other 2 emails were more of the same, getting angrier and more threatening with each one. I forwarded all 3 to Blake before I even got out of bed. He called me 20 minutes later and said he was filing a motion to hold Wade in contempt of court for violating the protective order. He said judges don't like it when people ignore their orders, and this would only make Wade look worse. That weekend, Bethany called and asked if I wanted to go to a networking event for women in accounting. It was at a hotel downtown on Thursday evening, and she thought it would be good for my business. I immediately felt nervous. Wade never let me attend professional events without him. He always said he needed to be there to make sure I represented us properly, which really meant he wanted to control who I talked to and what I said. The idea of going to a networking event alone made my stomach hurt. But I told Bethany yes anyway because I was tired of letting Wade's voice in my head make decisions for me. Thursday came and I drove to the hotel, parked, and sat in my car for 10 minutes trying to convince myself to go inside. Finally, I got out and walked through the doors before I could change my mind. The event was in a conference room with maybe 50 women standing around talking and eating appetizers. Bethany saw me right away and waved me over. She introduced me to 3 women who all needed bookkeeping help, and we exchanged business cards. Then she introduced me to 4 other women who became actual friends over the next few months. Women who understood what it was like to build a career and deal with difficult situations. Women who didn't judge me for leaving my marriage or ask why I stayed so long. By the time I left that night, I had 3 potential new clients and felt like maybe I could do this whole independent life thing after all. The contempt hearing happened 2 weeks later on a Thursday morning. Blake told me I didn't have to attend, but I wanted to see what would happen when Wade faced actual consequences for once in his life. We sat in a small courtroom with fluorescent lights that buzzed and made everything look washed out and depressing. Wade walked in wearing a charcoal suit that probably cost more than my rent, his hair perfectly styled, looking like he was heading to close $1 million deal instead of answer for violating a court order. His attorney sat next to him whispering something while Wade nodded with this concerned expression like he was the victim here. The judge was a woman in her 50s with reading glasses on a chain around her neck, and she did not look impressed. Blake presented the emails Wade sent from the fake account, the recording of his threatening phone call, and the police report from when he showed up at my apartment pounding on the door. Wade's attorney argued that his client was under emotional distress from the divorce and simply wanted to apologize for his past behavior. Wade even stood up when asked to address the court and said he made a mistake, that he still loved me and just wanted a chance to make things right. His voice cracked a little when he said it, and I watched him dab at his eyes like he might cry. The judge looked at him for a long moment without saying anything. Then she looked down at the protective order in front of her and back up at Wade. She told him that emotional distress was not an excuse for violating a court order, that the order existed precisely because of his pattern of controlling and threatening behavior, and that his claim of wanting to apologize rang hollow given the content of his messages. She fined him $1,000 and said if he violated the order again, she would hold him in contempt with jail time. Wade's face went red and I could see his jaw clench, but he just nodded and said, "Yes, Your Honor." Walking out of the courthouse, I felt lighter than I had in weeks, because someone with actual authority had finally told Wade he couldn't do whatever he wanted. 3 days later, Blake called to say Wade's attorney finally sent the financial disclosures we'd been requesting for over a month. I drove to Blake's office that afternoon and he spread the documents across his conference table. Even I could see they were incomplete. Tax returns from 3 years ago, but not the last 2 years. Bank statements from one account, but references to transfers to other accounts that weren't included. A list of assets that seemed way too short for someone who made the kind of money Wade claimed to make. Blake pointed to a line on one of the tax returns showing income from a real estate partnership, and then showed me that the partnership wasn't mentioned anywhere in the asset disclosure. He said Wade was either incredibly disorganized with his own finances, or he was deliberately hiding things. Blake told me he wanted to bring in a forensic accountant to analyze what Wade provided and figure out what was missing. The accountant's name was Julian Espinoza, and he specialized in finding hidden assets in divorce cases. Blake said Julian was expensive, but worth every penny because he could spot financial tricks that regular people would never notice. I agreed immediately because I'd spent 6 years watching Wade control every dollar, and I knew he had more money than he was admitting. Julian got started right away and called Blake within 48 hours. Blake put him on speaker in his office while I sat there taking notes. Julian said the discrepancies were obvious once you knew what to look for. Wade claimed certain income amounts on his tax returns, but completely different amounts in the divorce disclosures. There were multiple large transfers from Wade's main business account to other accounts that weren't listed in his asset disclosure. Some of the transfers happened right after I filed for divorce, which suggested Wade was moving money around to hide it from the settlement. Julian found references to 3 different LLCs that Wade owned or partially owned that weren't mentioned anywhere in the disclosure documents. Blake asked how much money we were talking about, and Julian said he couldn't know for sure without seeing the complete records, but based on the patterns he was seeing, it could be several $100,000. Blake thanked Julian and hung up, then immediately started drafting a motion to compel complete disclosure. He said we'd also ask the judge to sanction Wade for deliberately providing incomplete information. The motion went into the court system that Friday, and Blake said it would probably take 2 weeks to get a hearing date. The panic attack hit me on a Tuesday afternoon while I was grocery shopping. I turned down the cereal aisle and saw a man in a dark jacket standing with his back to me looking at something on a high shelf. He had the same build as Wade, the same way of standing with his weight on one leg, and for a second my brain was absolutely convinced it was him. My heart started racing so fast I thought I might pass out. My hands went numb and tingly. I couldn't catch my breath no matter how hard I tried. The edges of my vision got dark and fuzzy. I abandoned my cart right there in the middle of the aisle and walked as fast as I could to the bathroom, where I locked myself in a stall and sat on the toilet lid trying not to throw up. It took maybe 15 minutes before I could breathe normally again. When I finally came out, the man in the dark jacket was gone, and I felt like an idiot for falling apart over nothing. I left the store without buying anything and drove straight home. That night, I had an emergency session with Elena over video call and told her what happened. She said panic attacks were a completely normal response to trauma, that my nervous system had learned to associate certain triggers with danger, and was trying to protect me even when there was no actual threat. She taught me a grounding technique where you name 5 things you can see, 4 things you can touch, 3 things you can hear, 2 things you can smell, and 1 thing you can taste. She said it helps interrupt the panic response by forcing your brain to focus on the present moment instead of the perceived threat. We practiced it together until I felt steady again. The next morning, Mitch called while I was working on invoices for one of my clients. He asked if I was taking on new bookkeeping clients because his business partner needed help getting their financial records organized. The partner ran a small property management company and had been doing their own books, but it was getting too complicated as the business grew. Mitch said the partner was looking for someone reliable who could handle monthly reconciliations and quarterly reports. It would be steady work, probably 8 to 10 hours a month, and they were willing to pay my regular rate. I told Mitch I'd think about it and call him back. After we hung up, I sat at my kitchen table staring at my laptop and realized I had a real decision to make. I currently had 7 active clients, which kept me busy but not overwhelmed. Taking on Mitch's partner would mean 8 clients. If I kept growing at this rate, I'd need to decide whether I wanted to turn this into a real business with employees and an office, or keep it small and manageable as a solo operation. For the first time in my adult life, the choice was completely mine. Nobody was going to throw money at me and tell me what to do. Nobody was going to make this decision for me or take credit for my success. I could build this into whatever I wanted it to be. I decided to expand. The realization came while I was cooking dinner that night, standing at the stove stirring pasta and thinking about what I actually wanted my life to look like. I wanted financial security that came from my own work, not from depending on someone else. I wanted to help other small business owners the way my clients had helped me by trusting me with their finances. I wanted to prove to myself that I could build something meaningful. The next day, I started researching how to register an LLC. The process was more complicated than I expected, with articles of organization and operating agreements and registered agent requirements. I spent 3 days reading everything I could find and making sure I understood each step. Finally, I sat down at my computer with all the forms pulled up and started filling them out. Business name, business purpose, registered address. Every blank I filled in was just my information. My name, my choices, my business. No mention of Wade anywhere. No asking his permission or getting his approval. When I clicked submit and paid the filing fee with my own debit card, I felt something shift inside me. Like I was planting a flag on territory that belonged only to me. Wade's attorney produced additional financial records 2 weeks later, after the judge threatened sanctions at the hearing. Blake had argued that Wade's initial disclosure was deliberately incomplete, and the judge agreed, giving Wade's attorney 1 week to provide everything or face monetary penalties. The new documents arrived in a large envelope that Blake's assistant had to sign for. Blake called me to come to his office, and we went through everything together while Julian joined us on speakerphone. The additional records included bank statements for 2 accounts Wade hadn't mentioned before, documents for the 3 LLCs Julian had identified, and income records from side deals Wade had done in his real estate business. Julian went quiet on the phone for a minute while he reviewed the information Blake was describing. Then he said this was fraud. Wade had been systematically underreporting his income and hiding assets throughout our marriage. The side deals alone represented tens of thousands of dollars that never appeared in the original disclosure. Blake asked what this meant for the asset division, and Julian said it meant I was entitled to half of the real marital estate, not the fake reduced version Wade tried to claim. Blake looked at me across his conference table and said, "This changed everything." We had proof Wade had been lying about his finances, and the judge would not react well to that kind of deception. Lorelai started calling me the day after the judge threatened Wade with sanctions. The first voicemail was her crying about how I was destroying her son's life over money. The second one was angrier, saying I was a gold digger who never appreciated what Wade gave me. The third one said I was going to regret tearing apart the family. I got 6 more calls over the next 3 days, each voicemail getting progressively more hostile. She called me ungrateful, selfish, vindictive. She said Wade was a good man who made one mistake and I was punishing him forever. She said I should be ashamed of myself for dragging him through court instead of working things out privately like mature adults. I listened to the first few messages but deleted the rest without listening. That night, I had my regular therapy session with Elena and told her about the calls. Elena said I needed to block Lorelai's number because I didn't owe Wade's family access to me just because we weren't divorced yet. She said people who enabled abuse often got angry when the victim escaped because it forced them to confront their own role in allowing the abuse to happen. I blocked Lorelai's number as soon as I got home from therapy and felt guilty about it for maybe an hour before the relief set in. Julian's full forensic report arrived 3 weeks after he started his investigation. Blake scheduled a meeting at his office to go through the findings, and I brought a notebook because I knew there would be a lot of information to process. Julian attended in person this time, a thin man in his 40s with wire-rimmed glasses who spread spreadsheets and charts across the entire conference table. He walked us through his analysis point by point. Wade had underreported his income by roughly 40% throughout our entire marriage. He had money in accounts I never knew existed, including one offshore account in the Cayman Islands that held over $80,000. The side deals in his real estate business generated significant income that he never declared in the divorce proceedings. Some of the money he claimed was business expenses was actually personal spending he was trying to hide. Julian estimated the actual value of marital assets was close to $700,000, not the $300,000 Wade claimed in his initial disclosure. Blake asked what this meant legally, and Julian said it meant Wade had committed fraud by deliberately misrepresenting his financial situation in divorce proceedings. Blake said this would significantly impact the asset division because judges took a very dim view of people who lied under oath about their finances. He said we now had leverage to push for a much better settlement, or take this to trial, and let the judge punish Wade's deception. I celebrated landing my 10th client by taking myself out to dinner at a restaurant I'd been wanting to try for months. It was a small Italian place downtown with white tablecloths and candles on every table. I made a reservation for one, dressed up in clothes I bought with my own money, and drove there in my car that I paid for with my own earnings. The hostess seated me at a table by the window, and I ordered whatever I wanted without looking at the prices or calculating whether I could afford it. Pasta with seafood that cost $32, a glass of wine, tiramisu for dessert. When the check came, I paid it with my debit card connected to my business account and added a generous tip because the server was kind and attentive. Walking back to my car, I started crying right there on the sidewalk. Not sad crying, but the kind of crying that happens when something inside you finally breaks free. I'd spent 6 years asking permission for every dollar, picking bills up off the floor, being made to feel worthless for needing basic things. Now I was standing on a downtown street having just bought myself a nice dinner with money I earned doing work I was good at, and nobody had thrown a single dollar at me. Nobody made me grovel or beg or feel small. The money was mine because I worked for it, and I spent it because I chose to, and that simple freedom felt more valuable than anything Wade ever bought me to show off to his friends. 2 days after I celebrated with my expensive dinner, Blake called to tell me Wade's attorney wanted to schedule a settlement conference. I drove to Blake's office the next morning and found him reviewing documents at his conference table with Julian's forensic report spread out in front of him. Blake looked up when I walked in and said Wade's team was proposing a deal. I sat down across from him and waited while he pulled out a single-page document. Blake slid it across the table and I read through the offer. Wade would pay me $50,000 as a one-time payment, and I would sign away all claims to his business assets, his retirement accounts, and any future spousal support. Blake tapped the paper with his pen and told me this was insulting given that Julian's investigation showed Wade had hidden over $300,000 in assets that should be split between us. I asked Blake what he thought I should do, and he said we needed to counter with something that reflected what I was actually entitled to under the law. I told Blake to reject the offer, and he nodded like he expected that answer. Blake spent the next hour drafting our counter-demand. We asked for half of all marital assets, including every account Julian had uncovered, plus temporary spousal support while I built up my business to full sustainability. Blake sent the counteroffer that afternoon, and Wade's attorney called him back within 2 hours. I was still at Blake's office finishing up paperwork when his phone rang, and he put it on speaker so I could hear. Wade's attorney said our demands were extortion, and we were trying to punish Wade for being successful. Blake leaned back in his chair and told Wade's attorney that calling it extortion meant we were finally negotiating from a position of strength, which was exactly where we wanted to be. The call ended, and Blake said this was good because it meant Wade was scared of what Julian found. Bethany called me that weekend and asked if I wanted help setting up a real website for my bookkeeping business. I met her at a coffee shop downtown, and she brought her laptop with examples of sites she liked. We spent 3 hours picking colors and fonts and writing descriptions of my services. Bethany knew how to make everything look professional without being too fancy or expensive. She registered a domain name for me and had the site live by the end of the day. I paid her for her time, but she said it was a friend discount and I should just take her to dinner sometime. The website went live on a Monday, and by Friday I had 2 inquiries through the contact form. One was from a small property management company that needed monthly bookkeeping, and the other was from a solo attorney who wanted help organizing her business finances. I responded to both emails the same day, and scheduled calls with them for the following week. Both of them hired me after our conversations, and suddenly I had 12 clients instead of 10. I was starting to see that I could actually support myself long-term doing this work I was good at. The money was real, and it kept coming in, and nobody could take it away from me or throw it at my feet. 3 weeks after Blake sent our counter-demand, I received a notice that the court was ordering mediation before we could proceed to trial. I called Blake from my apartment and asked what this meant. He explained that the judge wanted us to try settling the case with a neutral mediator before taking up court time with a trial. Blake said this was standard procedure, but it meant I would have to be in the same room as Wade, even with the mediator and attorneys present. I felt my stomach drop because I had not seen Wade in person since the day I left. Blake asked if I was okay with attending mediation, and I told him I did not have a choice if the court ordered it. He said I could request that we do it virtually, but that sometimes made negotiations harder because people could not read body language as well. I decided I would go in person because I did not want Wade to think I was afraid of him, even though I absolutely was. I called Elena that night and told her about the mediation. She scheduled 3 extra sessions with me over the next 2 weeks to prepare for staying calm and advocating for myself when Wade was in the room. Elena taught me breathing exercises and grounding techniques, and we practiced what I would say if Wade tried to talk to me directly. She reminded me that the mediator would control the room and Blake would be right next to me the entire time. I practiced the breathing exercises every morning and every night until the mediation date arrived. The mediation took place in a conference room at a neutral office building downtown. I arrived 15 minutes early with Blake, and we waited in the lobby until the mediator was ready. Wade showed up 10 minutes later with his attorney, and I watched them walk past us without making eye contact. The mediator called us into the conference room and assigned us to opposite sides of a long table. Wade sat across from me looking smug and confident like he thought this was going to be easy. The mediator introduced herself and explained the ground rules, and then asked Blake to present our position first. Blake walked through Julian's forensic report page by page, showing the mediator every hidden account and every instance where Wade underreported his income. I watched Wade's face while Blake talked, and saw his expression change from smug to worried to angry. The mediator asked Wade's attorney to respond, and he tried to claim that some of the accounts were business assets that should not be included in the marital estate. Blake immediately countered with documentation showing that Wade opened most of those accounts during our marriage using marital funds. Wade's attorney asked for a break, and the mediator gave us 15 minutes. Blake and I went to a smaller room down the hall, and he told me this was going well, because Wade was realizing he could not charm or intimidate his way out of the evidence. When we returned to the conference room, Wade's attorney presented a new settlement offer. Wade would pay me $100,000 plus limited spousal support for 1 year. Blake looked at the numbers and then looked at me, and I shook my head. Blake told the mediator that this was still far less than half of what Wade actually had, and we were rejecting the offer. Wade's attorney requested another break, and I heard Wade shouting at him through the conference room walls. His voice carried down the hallway, and I caught words like ridiculous and greedy and ungrateful. Blake touched my arm and told me to ignore it because Wade was losing control, and that meant we had leverage. The mediator came back and said Wade's attorney needed more time to consult with his client. We waited for another 30 minutes before they returned to the conference room. Wade looked furious and would not make eye contact with anyone. His attorney said they were not prepared to offer anything higher, and we should proceed to trial if we could not agree. The mediator tried to find middle ground, but Blake said we were not negotiating against ourselves, and Wade needed to make a serious offer that reflected reality. The mediation ended without agreement after 6 hours of back and forth. Blake walked me to my car and said this meant we were headed for trial. He warned me that trials were expensive and emotionally draining, but he believed we had a strong case. Blake said Wade would likely settle once he saw we were serious about going in front of a judge who would review all of Julian's findings in open court. I drove home feeling exhausted and anxious, but also strangely proud of myself for sitting across from Wade and not backing down. I called Elena from my car and told her what happened. She said I should be proud because I advocated for myself in a situation designed to intimidate me, and I did not fold under pressure. That night, I looked at my business account balance and saw that I had earned more in the past month than in any month since starting my bookkeeping work. My income was growing steadily, and I was covering all my expenses without touching my savings. The financial independence I worked 3 years in secret to achieve was finally becoming real and sustainable. 2 weeks after the failed mediation, Blake called and said Wade's attorney contacted him with a new settlement offer. I was at my desk working on a client's monthly reconciliation when the call came in. Blake said Wade was now offering half of the documented marital assets, including all the hidden accounts Julian found, plus 2 years of spousal support, and Wade would pay my attorney fees. Blake said this was much closer to fair and asked what I wanted to do. I told him I needed time to think about it, and he said to take all the time I needed. I called Bethany first and told her about the offer. She asked if taking the settlement meant I would be financially secure, and I said yes. The amount Blake described would give me enough to fully establish my business and live comfortably while building my client base. Bethany asked if I wanted to keep fighting Wade in court, or if I wanted to move on with my life. I did not have an answer right away. I called Elena next and she asked me what my gut was telling me. I said my gut wanted this to be over, but I was also angry that Wade was not going to face public consequences for hiding all that money. Elena reminded me that my goal was freedom, not revenge, and I needed to decide which mattered more. I spent 2 days thinking about the settlement offer. I made lists of pros and cons. I calculated my projected business income for the next year. I imagined what it would feel like to accept the money and be done with Wade forever. I also imagined what it would feel like to go to trial and watch Wade squirm while a judge reviewed his fraud in open court. Both scenarios had appeal, but only one of them let me move forward immediately. Taking the settlement meant ending this now and moving forward with my life. Going to trial meant months more of Wade being present in my thoughts and my schedule and my stress levels. I realized that my freedom was worth more than punishing him. I called Blake on the 3rd day and told him I wanted to accept the settlement. Blake said he would negotiate a few final details to make sure everything was airtight, and then we would sign the agreement. I felt relief wash over me as soon as I made the decision. The fight was almost over, and I was going to walk away with enough money to never depend on anyone again. Blake called me the next day with Wade's counteroffer. 3 years of spousal support instead of 2, and Wade would refinance the house within 90 days to buy out my half of the equity. I sat at my kitchen table while Blake explained that Wade's attorney made it clear this was the final offer. Wade wanted this settled fast because the longer it dragged out, the more chance someone in his business circles would hear about the hidden accounts and the fraud Julian uncovered. Blake asked if I could live with these terms. I said yes before he even finished the question. The extra year of support meant more security while I built my business, and getting my equity in cash instead of forcing a house sale meant I wouldn't have to deal with real estate agents and open houses and Wade trying to sabotage the process. Blake said he would draft the final settlement agreement and have it ready for my signature by the end of the week. 5 days later, I walked into Blake's office to sign the settlement. The conference room felt different this time because I knew this was the last step before freedom. Blake had the agreement laid out on the table, pages and pages of legal language that basically said Wade had to pay me what I was owed, and then we would never have to speak again. My hands shook when I picked up the pen. Not because I was scared or uncertain, but because I was about to sign away 6 years of my life and replace them with a future I built myself. Blake pointed to each signature line, and I signed my name over and over until we reached the last page. He collected all the copies and said the judge would review everything within the next few weeks. Once the judge approved it, the settlement would be legally binding, and I would finally be free. I thanked him for everything he did to get me here. He said I did the hard part by leaving and having the courage to fight for what I deserved. While waiting for the judge's approval, I threw myself into my bookkeeping business. I had a consultation scheduled with a medical practice that needed comprehensive bookkeeping services, not just the basic monthly reconciliations I usually handled. The practice had 3 doctors, 2 locations, and complicated billing that their current bookkeeper couldn't manage. I met with the office manager and one of the doctors at their main location. They explained their needs, and I walked them through my process, showing examples of reports I created for other clients. The doctor asked about my rates, and I quoted them a monthly retainer that was higher than anything I'd charged before. The office manager looked at the doctor and he nodded. They wanted to start immediately. I left that meeting trying not to smile too wide because the monthly retainer they just agreed to was more money than Wade used to give me for an entire year of groceries, gas, clothes, and everything else I needed. I called Bethany from my car and told her about the new client. She screamed so loud I had to pull the phone away from my ear. My next therapy session with Elena focused on processing all the complicated feelings that came with accepting the settlement. I told her I felt relieved that the divorce would be final soon, but also angry that Wade's fraud wouldn't be exposed in open court where his colleagues and clients could see what kind of person he really was. Elena asked what was more important to me, revenge or freedom. I said freedom, but that didn't make the anger go away. She said the anger was valid and I didn't have to choose between feeling it and moving forward. I could be angry about what he did while still choosing to prioritize my own healing over his punishment. We talked about the grief too, the years I lost to someone who treated me like I was worthless. Elena reminded me that those years taught me skills I was now using to build a successful business, and they showed me exactly what I would never tolerate again. The grief was real, but so was the hope, and I could hold both at the same time. By the end of the session, I felt like I understood that accepting the settlement wasn't about letting Wade win. It was about choosing myself. 3 weeks after I signed the settlement agreement, Blake called to say the judge approved everything. The first payment from Wade would arrive within a week, transferred directly to my bank account. I hung up and just sat there for a minute, letting it sink in. The money was coming, not thrown at me in crumpled bills while his friends watched, not tossed on the floor for me to pick up. Transferred into my account because a judge said I was entitled to it. When the payment showed up 7 days later, I logged into my banking app 3 times just to make sure the amount was real. Seeing that balance, money that represented my share of what we built during our marriage, felt like someone was finally saying I had value. That my 6 years weren't wasted. That I deserved to be compensated for everything I gave up when Wade convinced me to quit my job and focus on making our house a home. With the settlement money and my growing business income, I could finally afford to move somewhere better. I found a 2-bedroom apartment in a complex with good light and updated appliances. The second bedroom was big enough for a proper home office with space for a desk, filing cabinets, and bookshelves. I signed the lease and moved in over a weekend. Setting up my dedicated workspace made my business feel official in a way it never had when I was working from my laptop at the kitchen table. I bought a real office chair and a printer and organized all my client files in labeled folders. Standing in that room looking at everything I built, I felt like I was finally living the life I was supposed to have all along. 2 weeks after I moved, Blake's office sent over the final divorce decree for my signature. I drove downtown to meet with Blake one last time. He walked me through each section, explaining what it meant and what would happen after I signed. The decree laid out all the terms we agreed to, the payment schedule for spousal support, the division of assets, everything that would govern our separation going forward. Blake handed me the pen and I signed on the last page. He told me I should be proud of myself for standing up to abuse and building a new life from nothing. I realized sitting there in his office that I actually was proud. Proud that I planned my escape for 3 years without Wade knowing. Proud that I left with my dignity intact. Proud that I built a business that could support me. Proud that I fought for what I deserved instead of accepting whatever Wade wanted to give me. The divorce became final 30 days after I signed the decree. I woke up that morning and the first thing I thought was that I was legally single for the first time in 6 years. No longer Wade's wife, no longer tied to someone who treated me like I was beneath him. Just me, with my own name and my own life and my own future. The relief hit me so hard I had to sit down on the edge of my bed and just breathe for a minute. I made coffee and checked my business email and responded to a new client inquiry, doing all the normal things I did every morning, except this morning I was doing them as a divorced woman who answered to nobody. Bethany took me out that night to celebrate. We went to a nice restaurant, the kind of place I never went with Wade because he always picked where we ate. We ordered wine and appetizers and entrees that cost more than I used to spend on groceries for a week. Bethany raised her glass and said we were toasting to new beginnings and second chances. She told me she had never seen anyone transform themselves as completely as I had over the past year. I thanked her for being there through all of it, for encouraging me when I wanted to give up, for celebrating every small victory like it was huge. She said watching me build my business and fight for my freedom inspired her to make changes in her own life. We stayed at that restaurant for 3 hours, talking and laughing, and I realized this was what friendship was supposed to feel like when it wasn't controlled by someone who wanted to isolate me. The next week, one of my existing clients called with a referral. Her company had a connection to a mid-sized business that needed a part-time controller, not just basic bookkeeping. The position would involve managing all their financial operations, preparing reports for the owners, overseeing their bookkeeper, and handling tax planning. It was more responsibility than I'd ever had, but my client said she recommended me because I was the most organized and detail-focused person she'd worked with. The company wanted to meet with me to discuss the role. I scheduled the interview for the following Tuesday and spent the weekend preparing by researching the company and putting together a presentation of my qualifications and approach to financial management. I walked into the company's office on Tuesday morning, wearing my best interview outfit and carrying a portfolio with financial reports I'd prepared for other clients. The receptionist led me to a conference room where 3 people waited. The owner was a woman in her 50s who introduced herself and explained they needed someone to oversee all their accounting operations because their current bookkeeper was overwhelmed. I walked them through my experience, showing examples of reports I'd created and explaining how I'd streamlined processes for other businesses. They asked about my certification and my approach to tax planning. I answered every question clearly, feeling confident in a way I never did when Wade was around to undermine me. The owner looked at the other 2 people, nodded, and turned back to me. She said they'd like to offer me the position starting in 2 weeks, and when she told me the salary, I had to ask her to repeat it because it was almost double what I'd hoped for. She explained the benefits package that included health insurance with dental and vision coverage, retirement matching, and 3 weeks paid vacation. Everything would be in my name, my choices, my security that nobody could take away. I accepted on the spot and shook hands with all 3 of them, walking out of that building feeling like I'd just won something I'd been fighting for my entire adult life. The next week, I sent emails to 4 of my smaller freelance clients explaining I was accepting a full-time position and would need to end our arrangement. I kept working with 3 clients I genuinely enjoyed because their books were interesting, and they treated me with respect. The balance felt perfect between having steady employment with benefits and maintaining the entrepreneurial side that reminded me I could support myself entirely if I needed to. I updated my business website to reflect that I was only taking selective clients and raised my rates for any new work. 2 days before I started the controller job, an envelope arrived at my apartment that had been forwarded from my old place. The return address showed it came from across the state where Wade's parents lived. I opened it carefully and found a handwritten letter from Lorelei on floral stationery. She wrote that she'd been thinking about our last conversation and realized she hadn't understood what Wade did to me. She said she hoped I was doing well and building a good life for myself. The letter was short and didn't make excuses for Wade, which surprised me more than anything. I read it twice and then put it in a drawer, not planning to respond, but appreciating that she finally acknowledged the truth instead of defending her son. That Saturday, I went grocery shopping at a store across town that I'd started using because it was farther from my old neighborhood. I was comparing prices on coffee when I looked up and saw one of Wade's friends standing 3 feet away staring at me. He was someone who'd been at our house dozens of times, who'd laughed while I picked up money off the floor. He opened his mouth like he was going to say something, maybe ask how I was or tell me Wade missed me or some other garbage I didn't need to hear. I looked right at him without changing my expression. He closed his mouth, nodded once, and walked away down a different aisle. I went back to choosing coffee and realized I didn't care what any of Wade's circle thought about me anymore. They could believe whatever Wade told them about why I left. I had my own life now with people who actually respected me, and their opinions meant nothing. My therapy session with Elena that Thursday covered different ground than usual. She said I'd made remarkable progress over the past year and asked how I felt about the work we'd been doing. I told her I had healthy boundaries now, financial independence, and ways to handle the anxiety when it showed up. She agreed that I'd met most of the goals we set when we started. We talked about wrapping up therapy over the next few sessions instead of continuing indefinitely. The idea of not needing therapy anymore felt strange because these sessions had been my anchor through the divorce and everything after. But Elena explained that successful therapy meant reaching a point where I had the tools to handle things on my own. We scheduled 3 more appointments to work on my remaining goals and make sure I felt ready to manage without regular support. My business accountant called the following week asking me to come in and review my first year of self-employment taxes before filing. I drove to his office and sat down while he pulled up spreadsheets showing every dollar I'd earned from my bookkeeping business. He walked through the numbers explaining deductions and estimated payments I'd need to make quarterly, now that I had the controller job too. Then he showed me my total income from freelance work over the past 12 months. The number shocked me so much I asked him to show me how he calculated it. He pulled up my invoices and payments received, adding them right in front of me. I'd earned more from my bookkeeping business than I ever knew Wade made in a year from his commercial real estate work. The money I earned myself, that nobody could take away or throw at me like I should be grateful for scraps. I signed the tax forms and drove home thinking about how I'd built something real while Wade thought I was just sitting around waiting for him. 3 weeks into my controller job, I registered for a conference for accounting professionals downtown. The 2-day event had workshops on new tax regulations and software demonstrations and networking sessions. I'd never been to anything like it, because Wade controlled who I talked to and how long I stayed anywhere. I showed up the first morning and attended sessions on financial reporting and audit preparation. During lunch, I sat with 3 other women who ran their own bookkeeping businesses, and we talked about client management and pricing strategies. One of them asked for my business card after I explained how I structured my services. Two more people asked for cards during the afternoon networking session. I handed them out feeling confident and capable, like I belonged in these professional spaces. The second day, I went to advanced Excel workshops and a panel discussion about the future of small business accounting. I collected business cards from people who might become clients or referral sources, building a network that was mine instead of just being Wade's wife who showed up to his work events and smiled on command. That evening, Bethany called and said we should plan a real vacation together. I hadn't taken a trip in years that wasn't performing the role of Wade's perfect wife at some resort he chose. We spent an hour looking at beach resorts online, comparing prices and amenities and reading reviews. We found a place with good ratings that wasn't too expensive and booked a week 4 months out. I paid for my half of the room without asking anyone's permission or feeling guilty about spending money on myself. Bethany said this would be my celebration trip for everything I'd accomplished in the past year. We made lists of things we wanted to do and restaurants we wanted to try, planning the whole week without anyone telling us what we should do or where we should go. 4 months later, we flew to the coast and checked into the resort. We spent the first day on the beach reading books and swimming in the ocean. The second day, we rented bikes and rode along the waterfront. On the third day, we were having lunch at an outdoor cafe when someone at the next table raised their hand to call the server over. I didn't flinch. I noticed it immediately because for years I'd tensed up whenever anyone made sudden movements with their hands, always expecting Wade to throw something at me. But I just kept eating my sandwich without any reaction at all. That evening, we went shopping in the resort town, and I looked at jewelry and clothes without calculating the cost of everything or waiting for someone to make me grovel for what I wanted. We had dinner at an expensive restaurant, and I ordered what sounded good instead of choosing the cheapest thing on the menu. Walking back to the resort that night, I realized the healing had happened. So gradually, I didn't notice it was working, until I saw how different I felt from the person who used to pick up bills off the floor while Wade's friends laughed. 6 months after I started the controller job, my boss called me into her office. She said the company was growing faster than expected, and they needed someone to take on expanded responsibilities. She offered me a promotion to senior controller with a significant raise and oversight of 2 new staff members they were hiring. She told me I was the most detail-oriented financial professional she'd worked with, always catching errors before they became problems and finding ways to improve their processes. I accepted the promotion and thanked her for the opportunity. Walking back to my desk, I thought about how Wade's control had forced me to develop exactly these skills. I'd learned to track every penny, notice inconsistencies, and manage complex financial situations because I had to survive on whatever Wade decided to give me. The abilities that came from suffering through his abuse were now the foundation of my professional success, and he would hate knowing that his cruelty had made me better at something than he ever was. I spent 2 months researching cars online, comparing prices and reading reviews about reliability and safety ratings. I made spreadsheets tracking maintenance costs and fuel efficiency because I wanted to make the smartest choice possible with my own money. The dealership I chose was small and family-owned, not one of those high-pressure places where salespeople follow you around. I test drove 3 different models before deciding on a silver sedan that was 3 years old but had low mileage and a clean inspection report. The finance manager walked me through the paperwork, and when I signed my name on the loan documents, I noticed my hand wasn't shaking at all. This was my credit, my choice, my responsibility, and nobody could take it away or throw the keys at me like I should be grateful. Driving off the lot that afternoon, I kept glancing at myself in the rearview mirror because I looked different somehow, more solid and real than I had in years. The car wasn't fancy or impressive, but it was mine in a way nothing had been mine during my marriage to Wade. I parked it in my designated spot at the apartment complex and sat there for a few minutes just looking at it, feeling this quiet satisfaction that didn't need anyone else's approval or validation. 3 weeks later, I walked into Elena's office for what we'd agreed would be our last regular session. She asked me to reflect on where I was when we started compared to now, and I told her about the car and the promotion and how I'd stopped flinching when people made sudden movements. She smiled and said the growth I'd shown was remarkable, that most people who leave abusive situations take years longer to reach this level of independence and self-awareness. I thanked her for helping me see that leaving Wade wasn't the end of my story, but the beginning of the life I was meant to have all along. She reminded me that I'd done the actual work. She just provided tools and guidance, and the strength to use those tools came from inside me. We talked about what to watch for in terms of potential setbacks or triggers, and she gave me her card with instructions to call if I ever needed a tune-up session. Walking out of her office building that day felt different from all the other times because I wasn't going back next week. I was moving forward on my own with all the skills she'd helped me develop. I sat in my car before driving home and realized I wasn't scared of managing my mental health without regular therapy appointments, which meant the healing had worked deeper than I'd understood. A year after the divorce was finalized, I was sitting in my home office on a Saturday morning reviewing financials for 3 different clients. The sun was coming through the window warming my desk, and I had coffee in my favorite mug that I'd bought myself without asking permission or calculating if I could afford it. I finished reconciling accounts for the medical practice and moved on to the construction company's quarterly taxes, and somewhere in the middle of updating their expense categories, I realized I was genuinely happy. Not performing happiness for someone else or pretending everything was fine when it wasn't, but actually content with the life I'd built from nothing. My apartment was small, but it was mine, decorated how I wanted without anyone criticizing my choices. My business was growing steadily with clients who respected my work and paid me fairly. My job as senior controller gave me financial security and health insurance that nobody could take away. I had friends who actually knew me instead of just knowing Wade's wife, and I had skills and confidence I'd developed entirely on my own. The happiness wasn't loud or dramatic. It was quiet and steady, like finally being able to breathe all the way down to the bottom of my lungs after years of holding my breath. That afternoon, I was responding to client emails when a new message came in from someone I didn't recognize. The subject line said financial consulting question, and when I opened it, a woman named Sarah explained that she'd found my website while searching for help. She was trying to leave a controlling relationship, but had no access to money or credit, and she wanted to know if I did financial consulting for people in abusive situations. I read her email 3 times, seeing my own story reflected in her words about being cut off from accounts and having to ask permission for basic necessities. I hit reply immediately and told her yes, I'd be honored to help, and my first consultation was free because I understood exactly what she was facing. I explained that I'd been where she was and made it out, and I could help her create a plan for building secret savings and establishing independence. Writing that email, I felt something shift inside me, like the last piece of my healing falling into place. My suffering with Wade hadn't just been pointless cruelty I survived. It had given me specific knowledge and experience I could use to help other women escape the same trap. Sarah wrote back within an hour, asking when we could meet, and I scheduled her for the following Tuesday evening. Closing my laptop that night, I thought about how Wade probably assumed destroying me was his legacy. But instead, I'd turned his abuse into expertise that would help other people find freedom, and that felt like the best possible ending to what he'd tried to make me believe was my story.